Hi, I'm Emily Cherry, and I'm here with Dean Wendy Perdue of the University of Richmond School of Law. Dean Perdue, I have a few questions for you about your career as a dean, as a professor, as an attorney. Tell us a little bit about your family and early education.
So my father was a career naval officer, which meant we moved around a lot in my early education. I think I counted up and concluded in the first 12 years of my schooling, I went to 9 different schools. So it demands a certain amount of flexibility to navigate that. Interestingly, one piece of that, my father was in the Navy during a period when there were not many women certainly in the military as officers, but he worked with women in various roles. And one of the memories I have on that is he would pretty regularly come home at dinner and tell some story about some woman he'd worked with, and to hear him tell it, this woman was brilliant and could do anything. In retrospect, I'm not entirely sure what their roles were. They may have been administrative assistants, and probably were at that time. But that's not the story he told, and it certainly had an impact on me as I thought about what was possible going forward in my career.
That's fantastic. So tell us about a little bit going to your decision to go to college and to go to law school. Did you always know that those particular paths were in your future?
College, yes. I actually come from a fairly long line of well-educated women.
Mm-hmm.
My mother, my grandmother, and actually one of my great-grandmothers all went to college. So that was just assumed.
Mm-hmm.
Law school, not so much. There weren't any lawyers in my family that at least not in any close relationship. And I didn't really have much of a sense of what lawyers did or whether that would be something of interest. Though I was always interested in kind of government and policy, so that was in the background. So law school I didn't decide on until I was in college and took a couple of law courses and thought, actually this is kind of cool, maybe I want to do this. Though at the time I wasn't entirely sure what lawyers did. I just thought the intellectual work that they did, the subject matter seemed interesting. Again, I'm not clear how they did what they did. I just thought it would be a good thing to study.
Did you go straight from college into law school?
I did go straight through, though. In retrospect, I've wondered whether that was the right choice. That probably would have broadened my horizons if I'd done something else. But I did go straight through.
So you were at Wellesley for undergrad and then Duke for law school. Did you have any female teachers? I assume at Wellesley there were.
Yes. So Wellesley has a tradition. The university presidents have always been women at Wellesley since its founding, and half the faculty are women. One of the effects of that is that you just sort of take for granted that women will run things. I did spend my junior year at Williams College. Wellesley is part of a 12-college exchange, so you could choose to spend your junior year at a different school. Williams had just gone co-ed at that time, so it was an interesting time to be there. The seniors weren't entirely sure they liked the state of things. The other members of the class, the freshmen, sophomores, juniors had come in under those terms. The faculty seemed welcoming. They just weren't quite sure what to do with us. So I still remember quite vividly sitting in a philosophy class. I was a double major, economics and philosophy. So I'm in this philosophy class with a young professor who's probably, it looked like he was about 25, might have been older. And there are maybe 10 or 12 people in the class, small class. So I had my hand up and he looked at me and he'd clearly forgotten my name. Fine. So he looked at me and said, "Yes, ma'am." And here I am, 20, in the fashion of the day, which was work boots and a denim shirt and blue jeans. I wasn't really feeling like a ma'am at that point. point. And it did highlight to me that they were still not quite sure what to do with this. I was also very struck. Both the women faculty and the women students were overwhelmingly in what one would have thought of as more traditional female fields. So languages, art history. There were no women faculty and no other women students in either economics or philosophy.
Oh, wow.
Where at Wellesley, economics was one of the largest departments.
Mm-hmm.
So that brought home to me in ways that I hadn't been as conscious of what an impact it had to be at a place like Wellesley, where you just took for granted that women could do anything and probably would.
Yeah. After Wellesley, you went on to Duke. What was your law school experience like there?
Well, it was an interesting time to be in law school. Actually, I still remember studying for the LSAT with some friends they had a house at the beach, and so would sort of go to the beach for a while and then study. And also come back in the heat of the day and watch the Watergate hearings.
Oh, wow.
So Barbara Jordan, who was in the House, one of the congresswoman from Texas, amazingly articulate woman who would speak in fully formed paragraphs with topic sentences. And in some ways, I think that was part of the inspiration. I mean, it was going on at the time, and was very much a sort of a part of the world. And while still in Wellesley, before I got to law school, of course, we'd had Nixon's resignation. Before that, all of what went on with respect to Watergate. So it was a time when law was very much in the air and something that people paid attention to. Actually, I went down to the White House and watched Richard Nixon take off in the helicopter after he resigned.
Oh, wow.
I saw the helicopter lift off. It was a different time then.
Yeah.
So I got to law school. It started in 1975. About 20% of our class were women.
Yeah.
There were not many women faculty, and the ones that were there were quite junior. Mm-hmm. But the class, my classmates were very, very supportive. I never felt any sense of you don't belong, why are you here? There were a few times when I think I had a sense of the faculty being not entirely sure, not unsupportive, but just not entirely sure what to do with us. So I remember at one point our torts professor explaining that the reason women tended not to do very well in contracts is that they didn't understand the world of business. So that was amusing, since the two highest grades in contracts were women. Which we had a certain number of events like that I think actually in the end were helpful. And so you sort of heard the stereotype, and then we had people breaking the stereotype that meant it. For the men as well as the women, I think helped to counteract the biases that might have been there. The same torts professor tended to be a little dismissive of the women in the class. So one class we decided that in cahoots with the men, all of the women sat in the first two rows, and only the women raised their hands. And as best we could tell, he actually didn't notice. So, but it was fine.
Yeah.
I think it. Again, what I experienced was that the men were extremely supportive as colleagues. So it never felt like that we were sort of as a group embattled in any way. We were very supportive. But the starting recollection I have is, so moving from Wellesley to Duke. So there were some cultural shifts that were necessary.
I imagine so.
So first of all, we got to the law school in middle of August, and the other students weren't on campus. So I remember walking around campus, seeing this sort of pack of extremely large men who kind of traveled around campus together, and it took me a while to figure out that was the football team. I just hadn't quite figured that out. Of course, this is Duke. Basketball's very big, and I remember going to my first basketball game in Cameron Stadium, and we had the ROTC comes in with the flags and the women cheerleaders. I thought, oh my God, I've been transported back to the 50s. I had no idea. So going to school in Boston in the early 70s, there was not a lot of the sort of traditional ROTC and cheerleaders, and certainly not at Wellesley. Yeah. So it did sort of feel like I'd entered a filming of Grease or something. It just was a different world. But law school was exciting intellectually. I had a very supportive group of friends. In retrospect, one of the things I've observed is I think that, as I said, we had only a couple of women faculty, and they were very junior, and the students were very hard on those faculty. All of us were, the women as well as the men. They were green, and we didn't give them the benefit of the doubt. Having later moved into that role, was looking back more sympathetic to the world that they were coming into. It was also a time when in the recruiting world, law firms were beginning to be attentive to the fact that they actually had to hire women. I remember an interview with a big New York firm. A couple of New York firms had recently been sued for sex discrimination, and the interview was one of these where they were trying a little too hard. It was, oh, we'd love to have women. Oh, you can do anything you want. You want full-time, part-time, any way you want to do it. We just want to get more women here.
Just don't sue us.
Just don't sue us. That was kind of the message. One of my colleagues had an interview with a local North Carolina firm, and the interview went something like, well, we'd be happy to have women join the firm. Of course, the thing you need to understand is our clients probably won't be happy with a woman lawyer. And the thing is, we can't hide you in the library like those big New York firms. So that was, that was part of what was going on. I remember an interview with a firm in D.C. when I was interviewing for a summer job. Sat down, and the partner looked at my resume and said, "So, see, you did pretty well at Duke." Yes, yeah. How'd that happen? I mean, you're being a girl and all. I just looked at him in complete disbelief, and he said, "Oh, I like to josh the gals and give them a hard time." The same firm, a different partner asked me what my sign was.
Did you answer?
I did not.
Good for you.
So, nor did I accept the offer from the firm.
You got the offer.
I did. Well, actually, one of the things in retrospect, I regretted was that I hadn't told HR about either of those. I just concluded the better part of valor at that point was to say no thank you and to move on. I have very fond memories of law school, in part because I met my husband there. We were moot court partners, so that certainly colors my view of what happened. I was on the Law Review, spent a lot of time there, and was the first woman editor-in-chief for the Law Review.
Oh, awesome.
And happily, the subsequent EIC was also a woman, so I sort of felt like we got things off to a good start.
Definitely, sounds like it. Tell us a little bit about your first career out of Duke and what that search process was like for you.
So my first job out of law school was clerking for then Judge Kennedy. He was in the Ninth Circuit in Sacramento. I had interviewed with him the summer before. I interviewed during my second summer when I spent that summer working for Morrison and Foerster, a big law firm in San Francisco. Was toying with the idea of moving west, though ultimately I decided not to. And had an interview with Kennedy. He was relatively junior on the bench. He'd been appointed to the bench in 1975, so he'd only been on the bench a couple of years when I interviewed with him. I was very pleased to get an interview, and then of course to be hired. But the interviewing process was interesting, not so much with him, but a different interview. So I had, before leaving for California that summer, I also had a set of interviews with a couple of judges on the D.C. circuit. I thought things had gone well. That I packed up and headed out. And after I left, one of the judges called my home. My parents lived in D.C. at that point, so they're calling for me, and I had left, so instead got my mother and chatted with my mother for a while. And the judge said to my mother, well, I just want to encourage Wendy to apply for the court law clerk position. These are the so-called elbow clerks, or the private clerks, and then there were more of a staff clerk position. I said, well, we'd love to have her apply for that. We really would love to get some good women in those positions. But I won't be hiring her as a personal clerk. And of course you can understand, most of the judges wouldn't want to have women as their personal clerk. It just would be awkward. I'm sure you can understand. So they had a lovely chat, and then they hung up, and my mother called me to tell me that the federal judge had just said he refuses to hire women. So I thought, well, okay, what do I do? There wasn't much to do, but I thought I should tell the law school. Maybe they would want to know that. Maybe I wasn't sure what they'd do with that information, but that they should know that. So I called actually a person in I won't name names on this one, but a person in the administration who'd been a recommender for me. And he said, well, yes, well, here's the thing. We had a woman a couple of years ago who clerked for a judge, and halfway through the clerkship, there was a personal issue. I think she got a divorce, and she left the clerkship early. And it was very problematic for the judge. So I'm sure you can understand why judges would be leery about hiring women. I'm looking at the phone thinking, what? I'm not following. I'm just not following this. That some woman at some point in history had left a clerkship early. Had this never happened to men? So I didn't pursue that one with the law school, but felt particularly pleased when Judge Kennedy was not only willing to interview me, but give me the job. It was a terrific experience. Yeah. The judge actually was not in the courthouse. His offices were in an office building, and which meant he was separate from the court and separate from other judges. The beneficial effect of that is actually he spent a lot of time with his clerks. So we would go to lunch with him a couple times a week. Wow. He's a very good storyteller, and was just a very interesting person to spend time with. Lots of insights on about how law is practiced. He'd been a private practitioner, a relatively small firm in Sacramento for a number of years before he went on the bench. So that was just a real privilege to be able to spend that amount of time with a terrific judge who later went on to become a justice on the Supreme Court.
Excellent. So tell us a little bit about your path from the clerkship to legal education. What happened in between, and what led you in the path of legal ed?
So after working for Kennedy, then had decided not to stay in California, came back to D.C. And worked at what was then considered a large firm, Hogan and Hartson, now Hogan Lovells. They had, I'd say, 110 or 120 lawyers, and people thought that was just huge. Back in those days, when you joined the firm, you actually rotated among practice areas so that you got a broad exposure. I'm not sure if firms do that much anymore. So I was there 3 years and really got terrific experience, enjoyed lots of different practice areas, worked in antitrust, and then with that commodities regulation. Were involved in representation regarding the alleged manipulation of the silver market, and I learned a certain amount about commodities as a part of that. Worked for a very well-known lawyer named Barrett Prettyman, who represented the House Ethics Committee that was investigating in the ad scam scandal. This is the FBI ran a sting operation on a group of congressmen, bribing them, pretending to be Middle Eastern potentates or sort of powerful people from the Middle East, bribing congressmen. And they had them on tape stuffing money into pockets. So worked on that. It's quite fascinating. Yeah. Got the opportunity to work on a couple of briefs and Supreme Court cases. So it was a terrific experience. But legal education had been in the back of my mind even in college, since what interested me was not so much that I wanted to practice law, because I didn't actually know what that meant, but that I liked the study of law. And so that kind of had me thinking that that maybe academia would be where I'd want to go. The other aspect of that is that, as interesting as it was, the various different projects that I got at Hogan, as a lawyer, you don't really control your time. So in academia, you have the benefit of being able to control your intellectual agenda. And so I thought, well, this might be an interesting an interesting shift. So I interviewed and was fortunate to land at Georgetown, which was terrific in many, many ways, including at a personal level. We didn't have to move. Yeah. And that meant my husband wasn't in the position of having to relocate. I did interview around the country, and an aspect of that was trying to figure out what would work for him. He was in practice at Kirkland Ellis, a firm in D.C. And Georgetown was a terrific place. Still it was and still is, but a great place to go for a legal career. There were at the time I went there, the dean who hired me, Dave McCarthy, was really in the process of building a top-flight law school. And along the way, it hired a number of other women. So there were more senior women at the school who were wonderful role models as it progressed through. One of those, of course, went on to become dean for 15 years, Judy Oreen. I had been there probably 10 years, or less than that. I think she was 7 years by the time she took over as dean. And she transformed the school, and it was quite remarkable to see what a really talented leader could do. She's remained a mentor and, again, a role model as I've progressed through sort of the ranks of the academy and now moved into an administrative position. She was extremely good at managing her people and attentive to everything. The message I got from her is it all matters. You can't do it all, but it does all aspects of the environment of the education do impact students and the overall experience.
And that seems to be a lesson you've definitely taken to Richmond Law.
I think so. I think so.
I would agree. You've been in legal education for quite a number of years. What changes have you seen in your time?
So there have been a number of changes. Certainly there's much more attention to the broad range of skills that lawyers need. There's much more attention to clinical education, although in that regard, my experience may be somewhat unusual. Georgetown has always been a leader in clinical education, so they were doing it on a big scale even when other places were not. Indeed, when I was at Duke, back at the time I was a student, they were affirmatively hostile to clinical education. That was a waste of an education. You would learn everything you needed to know about the details of practice once you got out. So there are very few opportunities. That has changed dramatically at Duke as well as other places. But legal education as a whole, that has changed a lot. Composition of the student body has changed. We now run about 50% women. We're seeing many more women in on faculties and certainly in leadership positions. When Judy started as dean, she began she would get the women deans together when there were dean meetings, and they could all sit around at a very small table. Now we're up to about a third of the deans are women, so that's certainly changed. I think another thing that's changed, I do think student attitudes have changed. I mentioned when looking back, I think as students we were pretty tough on the junior women faculty at the law school, and probably had held them to different standards. That was true for the women students as well as the men. Shortly after I started at Georgetown, people told me a story that a few years before there'd been a death on the faculty. A tax professor had died, and so they had to recruit someone at the last minute to fill in, and found a wonderful woman tax professor to fill in. And the story goes that when the men students saw who their professor was, they stormed into the dean's office and demanded to know why they were going to have to try to learn tax from a woman. So I think that's changed. I hope that's changed. One thing that I'm not sure has changed, I think that expectations of presentation there's a more limited range of what's acceptable for women than for men. I think men faculty could run a wider gamut of just sort of how they presented. Over the course of my time as associate dean, I was before I came to Richmond, I was associate dean at Georgetown in various roles, but I had occasion to read a lot of faculty evaluations. It is much more common, and I'm afraid it is still much more common, to see comments from students about women's dress and appearance than for men. It was more common 20 years ago, but it still happens. And one of the things I was aware of as a pretty young faculty member, so when I started in teaching, I was, do the math, I was 28.
Oh wow, yeah.
So I was a kid, and establishing authority was more of a challenge for women. And I was aware of that just in the sort of student reaction. After I'd been in teaching a few years, I eventually co-authored a casebook in the subject area that I teach most in, civil procedure. And the first year my students used a book with my name on it, I was extremely aware of a kind of a different level of credibility. So where students in the past would have said, well, professor, in the book it says, and the implication being, and you obviously don't know very much. It might get the same question, but it would have a very different tone. It would say, in the book it says this, but I thought you were saying that. Much more of the, maybe it's my problem, not yours. And so needing to establish that level of credibility, I think, it's always there for anyone who's newly in a field, but it's a bigger challenge for women. This isn't actually about change, but I will tell you another story about an interaction I had. We always try and navigate with students the right balance between counseling appropriate behavior, but not being too defensive. So during the the hearings on Justice Thomas were going on. That was all the news. And right about that time, I did a moot court with my students. So I was the judge and wearing black robes, and they did an argument. And then at the end of the argument, I came down from the bench and took off the robe because I was going to step out of role. So in the process of taking off the black robe, a male student in the back row did a wolf call, whistled. So, the question is, okay, what do you do with that? Yeah. And it was clear right after he'd done it that it had dawned on him that maybe that was a bad idea. This is your professor. It's a bad idea in pretty much any context, but it was clearly a bad idea in this context. So, wasn't quite sure what to do, and the question is, do you give a lecture at that point on demeanor and respect? So the only thing I could come up with on the spot was to turn to humor. So I looked at him and said, I see we have a member of the Judiciary Committee here. Because there was a lot of sexism happening on the Hill at the time. I thought, okay, maybe we can diffuse the situation. It's a little hard to imagine anything comparable if it had been a male professor. But that's part of what was happening in legal education. I suspect there are aspects of that would still happen, though probably not that overtly. Sure. And we try to model for our students what appropriate demeanor would look like. I think in my current role, so I do teach on occasion. In my current role as dean, I think people are less likely to pull off something like that, even if the thought has crossed their mind. Sufficient gravitas with the position.
Yeah, I hope so. So, in your role as dean, as an administrator, as a professor, you're a busy woman. How have you found balance, professionally, personally, in your career, in your life? Or have you found balance?
Right, have I found that's interesting. So, actually, Judy has given advice to many people, including the women, and her advice has been, basically, you can do it all, but you can't do it all at the same time. And so that there are different periods of your life where some things dominate over others. And I do think that's been true for me. The other thing that matters is having an extremely supportive family. So I've been very fortunate in having a husband who was a classmate, but he's carried a big part of the load, and at times he's carried a bigger part of the load. So maintaining a balance does depend on those other pieces. I think my children would say that I was around enough, although I did spend a certain number of baseball games reading other packets of material. I think one of the beauties of baseball is that there's a lot of downtime. It's actually not bad for doing other things. But you have to figure out what's most needed at a particular point in time. Now my children are grown; they're not at home, so I'm not racing off to do carpool or go to baseball games. Though I am trying to figure out how to find a little more time to see my granddaughter, which is the next stage of work-life balance.
Excellent. Looking back on your career so far, what would you say has been the most rewarding part or the most frustrating part?
Well, I'll stay away from frustrating.
Yeah.
But rewarding, for me, the last now 12 or so years have been in administration. And what's been enormously rewarding about that is that it offers the opportunity to create an environment in which others can thrive. And so it's seeing how well faculty and students can succeed. That's really fun. And in the role of administrator, I do much more of that than try myself to be teaching, although I teach a little bit, or writing, which I don't do too much anymore of. So the impact comes less from doing that directly, but from, say, building an environment in which others can thrive. In some sense, that's a little bit like what one does with a home. You hope to build a place where the members of the family will thrive and be successful, and that becomes the goal. And I think that's what I've tried to do in my various administrative roles. And it's fun because you get to see lots and lots of the next generation doing great things.
Good. Well, glad you're having fun. Thank you so much for your time, Dean Perdue.
Thank you.